For the Rohingya people, this is an all too familiar exodus, fleeing in their thousands from Myanmar to Bangladesh, a desperate march to safety.
Buddhists are killing us by bullets. They burn houses and try to shoot us. They kill my husband by bullet.
The Myanmar government are torturing us too much, and we could not tolerate the torture, so we have come here.
From this side of the border, those who have recently escaped can only watch as the fires continue to burn. This latest wave of violence began after the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army attacked police posts and an army base. The group says it's in response to the ongoing atrocities and killings committed by the government and the military. The same group claimed responsibility for an attack on border posts in October, leading to a full military response to track down the perpetrators. But it's ordinary Rohingya, like these men, women and children, who are paying the price. Like they've done many times before, as one of the world's most persecuted people. The area that is known as Rakhine used to be the Kingdom of Arakan. As early as the 9th century, Muslims are thought to have travelled there. But the origins of the Rohingya are disputed, because in 1824, during the British colonial period, Muslims were brought from Bengal to work. Many in the Rohingya community say their legacy begins before the colonial period, but the state and many Burmese say it doesn't. There's been ongoing conflict between the Rohingya and Burmese nationalists and the army for decades. But it's more recent history which has dramatically affected everyday life for the Rohingya. The 1982 citizenship law grants full citizenship to people who can trace their lineage in Myanmar prior to 1823, which excludes the Rohingya. It also restricts their rights to work, study, travel, practice their religion, and even to access healthcare. The Rohingya have faced discrimination, intercommunal violence, and military crackdowns. In Myanmar, even their name is political. State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi describes them instead as Muslims, or the Muslim community in Rakhine. A commission on Rakhine State led by former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan reported that intercommunal conflict is leading to a real risk of radicalisation. And if the legitimate grievances of local populations are ignored, they will become more vulnerable to recruitment by extremists. But what can be done to stop the cycle of violence and persecution, which has scarred generations of Rohingya? Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Let's get more on this with our panel. I'm joined now from Amsterdam by Clark Kjor. He's the chairman of the European Rohingya Council. And from New Delhi, Anaga Neelakantan. She's the Asia Program Director for the International Crisis Group. Thanks both of you for joining us. Anaga, let me begin with you first. A lot of people see these extraordinary images of these Rohingya Muslims crossing the border into Bangladesh, people on the move. They've not been hit by floods or a hurricane. This is not a natural disaster. Is it more of a political crisis?
Well, clearly, International Crisis Group, we've said for quite a long time that there are deep policy failures that have been made by successive governments in Myanmar over a very long period, and that they were creating conditions that could lead to really volatile situation. You see it now. This was not unpredictable. It was not unavoidable. There were clear signs, I think. There's a very long history, obviously, but the anti-Muslim violence and the violence in Rakhine State in general in 2012 and the emergence of this new militant group in October last year were pretty clear signs that time was running out. And despite that, there's been very little movement on the policy front to address the very complex dynamics in the state. So yeah, it is a political disaster.
And do you believe, Anaga, that Kofi Annan's plan has failed?
Well, it's just been issued. The Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, which Kofi Annan headed, issued its report, of course, the day these attacks happened, these awful attacks and happened last week. But it does remain a pretty reasonable, realistic road plan, path forward. It's not going to make everyone happy, but this is a really complex situation that's going to need quite a lot of compromises on all sides. It's now, the onus is on the government, which has welcomed the report, to announce how it's going to start rolling out the implementations. Of course, before that can happen, the situation in Rakhine State needs to be stabilized.
Kyo, what's your message to the government of Myanmar?
Yes, our message to the government of Myanmar is to immediately stop Army's atrocity crimes against Rohingya people, to immediately stop dehumanization of the Rohingya people across the country. This is to immediately stop misframing desperate Rohingya villagers as a terrorist, which is very, very dangerous. And this is what we want to send the message to the Burmese government, to immediately stop mass burning of Rohingya villages, indiscriminate shooting to the children and women. Yes.
Yeah, something I want to understand here. You say framing, desperate villagers as terrorists. So that's one thing, right? And there's an accusation of collective punishment, which seems to be taking place. On the other hand, this particular group, who were called Harakat al-Yaqin and now called Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, they have been actively attacking military and police outposts. They've been killing people. Do you separate them from the ordinary people? Do you condemn their tactics?
It is very important to know that they have already mentioned in their statement that they were surrounded by the security forces, and they had to defend themselves and the lives of their loved ones. And this situation was used as a justification to launch mass atrocities against Rohingya villages. And since last 2 weeks, the newly arrived army, have surrounded several villages in Arakan, in Maungdaw, Butidong, Ratidong area, and they have surrounded the villagers, and the villagers cannot go out to buy food and water. And finally, the villagers they became very, very desperate, and then they took what they have to attack and the police forces. This is like a popular uprising, like in inmates in the prison, in Nazi concentration camps.
Okay. Let me ask you again, just to be absolutely clear, because you're saying popular uprising. This group has an Amir. I've got his name here, Amir Ataullah Abu Ammar Jununi. They have an Amir. They have certain theological and philosophical ideas which are very similar to some other jihadi groups, right? So they might be getting outside support. They are conducting attacks. What I'm saying is that I'm giving you the opportunity, and I'm asking you very clearly, do these people, this small group, have anything to do with the ordinary villagers who just want to go about their lives and who are being killed or being pushed out of their homes? Because I'm not absolutely sure what you're trying to tell me, whether these guys represent the people or whether they are separate from the people. So here's your opportunity to clarify.
Yes, actually, the ordinary children and women have nothing to do with this group, and this group has already mentioned in their statement what they are doing and why they are doing that. So the ordinary villagers, like innocent children and women, have nothing to do with what Burmese government is claiming, that everyone is misframed as a terrorists. This is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, Anaga, is that what's happening? This sort of collective punishment, as we see an insurgency on the one hand, and then you have the Rohingya people who, through an accident of history, happen to be in a place where they're not wanted, so they're being blamed for everything?
Well, it's certainly true that this group appears to have expanded. It's become stronger. And there are reports that might be credible that this group, members of this group, I want to be clear, not ordinary Rohingya people and people in Rohingya communities have attacked non-Muslim, at least one non-Muslim village, leading to the death of some people. Now, I find it very hard to believe that this group, this militant group, would be seen by ordinary Rohingyas as a legitimate representative of their cause, because it's very clear, and it should have been clear to the leaders of this group, based on their experience and what followed their attacks last October, that any action like this is going to harm the Rohingya cause more than it's going to help it.
Yeah, let's have a little listen to the UN Human Rights Chief, who had some very strong words about what's been going on.
Decades of persistent and systematic human rights violations, including the very violent security responses to the attacks since October 2016, have almost certainly contributed to the nurturing of violent extremism, with everyone ultimately losing.
So, Hla Kyo, you have the UN Human Rights Chief using the word systematic. I think that's quite important, and a lot of culpability then, the blame going towards the government there. You have, in the past, the Rohingya people said nobody cares about us. You've had the Turkish president and others speak out about it, a UN Security Council meeting. Are you seeing now greater international awareness for your cause?
Actually, we are quite disappointed. It is quite disappointing that international community is not doing anything effective to stop Burmese atrocity crimes against Rohingya villagers, especially children and women. And also, this is actually, of course, it is long-standing, systematic, state-directed, state-sponsored persecution of the Rohingya people. This is one of the largest the Burmese crimes against the Rohingya people. In 1978, they expelled the more than 270,000 people. In 1991 and 92, and in 2012 until 2015, and last year in 2016 October, and now this is systematic and long-standing standing state-sponsored persecution against the Rohingya people. Yes. We are not seeing anything effective by the international community. Yes.
Yeah, what do you want to be done? Do you want the Rohingya people to be given citizenship? How do you see this moving forward? What can be done by outside forces to pressure the government, and what can that government then do to make you happy?
Yes, right now the emergency, it is emergency situation. It is international emergency situation actually. So what we want is United Nations Security Council mobilize United Nations peacekeeping forces there, and to create under the United Nations a safe zone. So, and then humanitarian aids and international media are allowed to go there to investigate what is going on there. And also, we want the Burmese government to immediately stop the mass atrocity against the Rohingya people. And finally, we want to get the rights what we got after independence 1948. We were legitimate, recognized ethnic Rohingya ethnic and citizenship of the Myanmar until 1962. So we want the same right as we had before, like any other ethnic groups in Myanmar. This is what we want. And also, we want Kofi Annan Commission recommendation to be implemented as soon as possible, immediately.
Arakan, what does it mean to you when you see those images coming from places like Yangon and hundreds of people take to the streets in support of the state's approach to the Rohingya, and they chant nationalist slogans with a lot of Buddhist nationalism attached to it, and they call for the government to be tougher on the Rohingya. Tell me what that means.
Well, I mean, as you know, I'm sure, this is an incredibly polarizing, divisive issue in Myanmar society. It's probably safe to say that the vast majority of people in Myanmar, and the politicians also, are not really sympathetic to the Rohingya, I won't say cause, but the plight of the Rohingya people. So what's happening in Rakhine is driven by local dynamics, but it is happening in a broader context in Myanmar, where there is the rise, as you mentioned, of Buddhist nationalism and also a certain anti-Muslim feeling across the country. And the real danger is, of course, if you start to as Lacha was suggesting, if you start to sort of see all Rohingya as the same as members of this group, it becomes a very different framing of the problem. It doesn't become about Rohingya communities believing they have a legitimate right to be citizens of Myanmar and to be able to move around freely and access services. It becomes about tarring a whole community with a brush of being a jihadist or terrorist, which is clearly not going to help anything in the long run. It's certainly not going to help the government deal with the situation in Rakhine.
And then, Anaga, when these thousands of people go to Bangladesh and they cross the border in desperation, the Bangladeshis are not too keen to have them. What's behind that dynamic?
I think countries have a hard time accepting large inflows of people. Bangladesh is hardly unique in this. There's a very complex regional dynamic, obviously, and Bangladesh has its own domestic issues. I think while it's important to know what Bangladesh can do with these very large numbers and for these very large numbers of Rohingya, the real issue and the solution to the issue lies in Myanmar to start with.
Kyo, there's been a lot of talk about the Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi and how she's almost tarnished her moral standing, her moral reputation, and let down the people of Rakhine State, especially the Rohingya. Has she let you down personally?
Of course, we have been supporting her while she was in home arrest, and we have been protesting for her release. So now she is collaborating with what the army is doing, atrocity crimes against the Rohingya people. And on top of that, a state consular information Facebook page is spreading propaganda news, and also inflammatory rhetoric, which is believed by the people around in whole Myanmar. This is very, very dangerous, and also, and she herself is Islamophobes. So she is really become the shield for the international community to go and do any intervention there.
Anaga, has she tarnished her reputation? And is she an Islamophobe, as La calls her?
What the government of Myanmar does and what the State Councillor's office
This is on the record. This is on the record.
Sure. Go ahead, Anaga.
Sure. I mean, I think we need to see what happens in the coming weeks. Obviously, I think internationally it's expressed quite widely a real sense of disappointment in Aung San Suu Kyi. But that is in its place. What we need to see now is what the government of Myanmar does in the next few weeks. That its actions are how it should be judged in the weeks to come.
Anaga, what do you think they'll do, given the international condemnation, given that there is some pressure on them now? And I guess, you know, the Rohingya will feel that nobody really cares about their cause, but we're seeing more and more people talk about it now. So how do you think they will respond?
I mean, I suspect they know very well how very, very serious this is for them politically, diplomatically. So both domestically as well, there's a huge impetus to make sure this doesn't spill over. And internationally, I'm sure there is an awareness that this is not being viewed in any favorable light. I would imagine in a best case scenario, what would happen is that the military response is proportionate and doesn't target civilians. That in a really best case scenario, that humanitarian agencies and media have unfettered access to all parts of Rakhine, of northern Rakhine anyway, and all communities in Rakhine State. And the third and most important thing is that there is a plan announced for the rollout of the recommendations of the Annan Commission, and that's done quite fast. So those are the sorts of actions that will indicate to us what approach the government is going to take.
Yeah, and
it should be judged on both fronts.
Yeah, the government has really consistently refused visas for a proposed UN fact-finding team. We'll have to wait and see as to whether that changes. Very finally, Hla, there were going to be 3 people on this panel. At the last minute, we lost someone who was I guess, somebody who was pro the Myanmar government. And as my producer was discussing this story with this particular individual. This person said that the Rohingya are not Rohingya, they're just Bengalis. And it's really interesting. Terminology is so, I guess, toxic and important in this. When they just say, you're just Bengalis, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, it is really that means to us as an insult. We have a universal human right to identify ourselves as a Rohingya, as an individual, or as a collective group. We have these human rights, universal human rights, and he is ignorant of the fact, historical fact, that we have been recognized as a ethnic community, as a citizenship of Myanmar with Rohingya. Even in the book of curriculum of Burmese school, the Rohingya they are mentioned there. Rohingya are one of the ethnic community there. So he is ignorant of the fact that we belong to the Myanmar as a Rohingya, as an ethnic community, as one of the ethnic communities of Myanmar, as recognized citizen of the Myanmar. Since 1982, citizenship law that stripped our citizenship rights and ethnic rights.
Yeah, well, we sincerely hope for an end to the suffering of the people of the region. It's a terrible situation. Hla Kyo and Anagat Nilakantan, I'm going to have to move on. I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.